Two great leaders in the black community in the late 19th and early 20th century were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. However, they disagreed sharply on strategies for racial and economic progress. At the time, W.E.B. Du Bois and Washington dispute polarized African American leaders into two wings of the black community, the more conservative supporters of Washington and his more radical critics. W.E.B. Du Bois' philosophy of agitation and protest for civil rights flowed directly into the civil rights movement, which began in the 1950s and exploded in the 1960s. Booker T. Washington was associated, perhaps unfairly, with self-help, colorblind, Republican wing of the black community and its leaders. Welcome to One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy. And if you hadn't guessed, this episode is about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois and their conflicts over the direction of the black movement in the early 20th century. This episode will primarily focus on Booker T. Washington and his conflict and criticisms from W.E.B. Du Bois. Without further ado, if you like this, if you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page so I can continue bringing you dope content. Also, give us 5 stars, rate us on Apple Podcasts, and lastly, listen to The Cut for all your black pop culture needs. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in 1856 on a farm in Virginia Blue Ridge Mountains. His mother was an enslaved African-American woman by the name of Jane, with no middle name or last name, which was the practice at the time. His father was unknown, but Washington's light brown skin, reddish hair, and gray eyes heavily suggested white paternity. Washington would later comment on his father, saying, "I was never able to learn with any degree of certainty who he was." But a century later, his daughter would insist her grandfather was a man by the name of Ben Hatcher, a local blacksmith who took his mother in after a runaway attempt, and she was pregnant with Booker when she was recovered by her slave owners. Either way, Ben Hatcher played no part in Booker T. Washington's life. The plantation that he lived on was owned by a man by the name of James Burroughs. Burroughs owned 10 slaves, 6 of them being children. Washington was one of those 6 children, and at the time was simply known by the name Booker. Washington would recall his slavery days, stating, "My life in its beginnings in the midst of the most miserable and desolate, discouraging surroundings." He would later also speak on his schooling as a slave, stating that, "I had no schooling whatsoever while I was a slave, although I remember on several occasions I would go as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my mistresses to carry her books." The picture of several dozen boys and girls in a schoolroom engaged in study made a deep impression on me, and I had a feeling that getting into the schoolhouse and study in this way would be about as the same as getting into paradise. He expressed resentment to his mother about not being able to go to school, and she simply explained to him that this was the reality of the slave's condition. And from that moment, it was clear to me that I could not go to school and that it was dangerous for me to learn to read. And from that moment, I resolved that I could not be satisfied until I learned what this dangerous practice was like. After the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, his family moved to Hales Ford, West Virginia, to be with his mother's new husband, a man by the name of Washington Ferguson. From there, his family walked almost 200 miles from Hales Ford, West Virginia to Maiden, West Virginia. The trip took several weeks and they slept outside for most of the trip. Washington would recall this trip and remembered it as a fun adventure. After arriving in Maiden, Washington was still unable to go to school, and at the age of 9, he began working in the salt furnace and later in the coal mines with his mother's husband, Washington Ferguson. Determined to get an education, he was able to persuade his mother and Ferguson to let him go to school if he worked in the salt works from 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. Once at school, he realized that he needed a surname, so he spontaneously came up with the last name of Washington, and later discovered that his mother considered Tafero to be his surname, and he took that up as his middle name, and the name Booker T. Washington was born. While he was much older and working in the coal mines, he overheard 2 black miners discuss a newly established school for blacks in Hampton, Virginia, a place where poor students could work and earn a tuition and board. In 1872, Washington left Maiden with very few cash because Ferguson appropriated most of his wages. He traveled almost 500 miles with very little money before arriving in Hampton Creek. He enrolled in Hampton's Normal and Agricultural Institute, now Hampton University, in Virginia in 1872. Working as a janitor to pay his school expenses, he graduated in 1875 and returned to Maiden, where he would conduct a color school where he taught 90 children during the day and about 90 adults at night. He also tutored students at night, taught 2 Sunday schools, and did supplemental learning lessons for combing hair and brushing teeth and bathing. Following his studies at Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. in 1879, he was asked by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who was the man that established Hampton University, to deliver the commencement speech at Hampton. After the commencement speech, Washington was asked to join the staff at Hampton as a teacher. In 1881, Washington, after a few years of teaching at Hampton Institute, General Armstrong told Booker about a request from Tuskegee, Alabama, for a white man to organize and run a normal school. Armstrong replied that he knew of no good white candidates, but he knew of a very competent, capable mulatto who was clear-headed, modest, sensible, polite, thorough teacher, and a superior man. The Normal Institute opened in July 4th of 1881 with only one building to hold classes. This was Zion Negro Church. It had cracks that poured in sunlight, cold, air, rain. During wet weather, a student would have to hold an umbrella over Booker as he taught. Most of the students didn't have money for school, so Washington put them to work as he did when he was at Hampton. Washington understood that he and his students would have to build Tuskegee Institute themselves. He felt that building the school themselves would make it an exclusive African American achievement. It proved that blacks could accomplish a large, complex task and demonstrate to whites that blacks were capable of running a large enterprise without the help or interference of whites. Almost every other black institution of higher learning was built and run by whites. Many whites in the South were opposed to black education. South Carolina's Governor Ben Tillman said that when you educate a Negro, you educate a candidate for the penitentiary, or you spoil a good field hand. The opposition reflected white anxiety about political control. They felt that blacks would take advantage of schoolhouses, get educated, and vote them out. One of the most powerful arguments from white Southerners against black education was that black children getting educated would take limited resources for education from whites. It was a zero-sum game, that any gain for blacks was a loss for the status of whites. White Southerners connected their opposition to black education to blacks' interest in politics. By the end of the first year at Tuskegee, Washington faced a diverse and unscrupulous means of white oppression. So Booker would model Tuskegee as a model community of race relations, a place where whites and blacks could pretend they had no past conflicts. Washington knew this model was compatible with Southern whites' ideas of the Old South. The idea of the model community is that blacks had no reason to complain about the racial condition, and it prevented blacks from engaging in the dangerous act of criticism how they were treated. This idea created a perfect island of racial harmony in a world filled with racial conflict. This bought Washington the space and time he needed to do the work in building Tuskegee University. By 1888, Tuskegee Institute had more than 400 students and 25 members of faculty. When the school began a thriving trade in carriage and wagon building, their white neighbors would regard the black man who would supply skills as a valuable asset to the community. Washington saw this racial independence as a fundamental principle of his strategy for African Americans. The individual that can do something in the world that the world wants done will in the end make his way regardless of race. While whites got suspicious of local blacks controlling so much of the local property, Washington believed he had demonstrated what blacks could do on their own. The vision of that schoolroom and the idea of learning was paradise would provide a lifelong inspiration for Washington And Tuskegee Institute was the embodiment of Washington's overarching belief that African Americans should forego political agitation in favor of a industrial education and agricultural expertise. When it was established that the Institute had only 2 small buildings and no equipment and very little money, but Tuskegee's Normal and Industrial Institute will become a monument to Washington's life work. It was at this time that Washington became a public man who took a position in important race matters. Washington would begin to strongly condemn the sharecropper system, saying that the crop lien system robbed black farmers of nearly half of their earnings, and it was impossible under the sharecropping system to escape debt and gain independence. He was also spoke out about convict leasing, in which a prisoner was leased to a private contractor to work on railroads, mines, and farms. The system resulted in appalling inhumanity because prisoners were almost disposable to the private contractors. One Georgia prisoner's feet rotted off when he was forced to work in the winter without shoes. Anything Washington would say publicly was undercut by white Southerners' belief that blacks would not be able to survive in freedom, and they would ultimately die out without the care or concern from their white masters. In the 1880s, this began to change when blacks began to gain status and attempted to educate themselves. Whites felt that blacks would begin to compete with whites for jobs and would inevitably lead to a racial competition. In 1895, Booker T. Washington would deliver his famous Atlanta Compromise speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta. Considered the definitive statement of what Washington termed his accommodationist strategy of black response to Southern racial tensions in an attempt to diffuse white anxiety about black competition. It was widely regarded as one of the most significant speeches in American history at the time. Washington's speech responded to the Negro problem, which was a question about the relationship between blacks and whites in an economically shifting South. Washington was attempting to challenge the demonization of blacks, and his opportunity would take place in 1894 at a committee meeting with the House of Representatives, at which funding had been requested for the Cotton States and International Exposition. In 1893, at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, blacks had been excluded, and there had been loud criticisms about that slight. So to resolve any criticism beforehand at the Atlanta Exposition, they asked for black advocates to speak to the House committee. The exposition planners asked Washington to speak about the American Negro to the House of Representatives. In recognition to his effectiveness before Congress, the exposition planners asked him to oversee the preparation of a Negro building at the exhibit. Washington would decline, but arranged for an appointment of an acquaintance to represent blacks' interests at the exposition. Some blacks objected to the segregation black event space, but Washington accepted it as an opportunity to show black achievements rather than having blacks disappear in a sea of white exhibits. The event planners decided that it would be a good public relations gesture to also have a black speaker at the opening ceremony. Washington's emphasis on economic goals among blacks and his appeasing posture towards white Southerners made him the perfect complement to the new Southern movement ideals at the event. So they asked him to be the speaker at the opening ceremony. In September 18th of 1895, when he delivered his speech, he began by thanking the organizers for recognizing the value of the American Negro. This was at a time when Southerners saw blacks as worthless and bestial. He conceded to white Southerners what they already thought, that it was a mistake to enfranchise the American Negro and that the days of black political activism were over. Reconstruction had been a misguided experiment that led blacks to believe they could begin their freedom at the top and that a seat in Congress was more valuable than owning land or having a skill. Washington was willing to concede independent black political power in an attempt to reduce white hostility. Washington insisted that blacks had learned from the past and that the masses of us are willing to live by the production of our own hands. Washington described blacks as faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful, all traits that contradicted the opinion of Southern whites. This was an attempt to counter the belief that free blacks had declined in character and morality in the 30 years since slavery. Washington promised his audience that he would encourage blacks to be more proficient in agriculture, mechanics, commerce, and domestic service, and that he would encourage them to dignify and glory common labor. Washington also eased whites' fears about blacks' desire for social integration by stating that both races could be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Washington's speech also called for whites to take responsibility for improving social and economic relations between the races, praising the South for some of the opportunities it had given blacks since the Emancipation Proclamation. Washington asks to trust blacks and provide them with opportunities so that both races could advance in industry and agriculture. This shared responsibility became known as the Atlanta Compromise. The speech was greeted with a thunderous applause and a standing ovation. Clark Howell, editor of the Atlanta Constitution, proclaimed that the speech was the beginning of a moral revolution in America. Washington's words were greeted enthusiastically by whites in both the North and the South, and by most of the African American leaders. The Southern fame that Washington gained in Atlanta thrusted on him by blacks looking for a new leader because Frederick Douglass had passed away in 1895. Washington was also in step with the general shift in orientation of blacks away from politics towards economic and educational progress. His ascension to national black leadership was a result of the timing of the Atlanta speech, the death of Frederick Douglass, and the lack of other viable candidates. He accepted his leadership role without hesitation, but ironically, before the Atlanta speech, he rarely sought the limelight and never attempted to gain popularity or fame with blacks. Capitalizing on his fame from the Atlanta Exposition and the publishing of his autobiography Up From Slavery, Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him and his family as his race advisor shortly after moving into the White House. Roosevelt saw Washington as a brilliant advisor on race matters, and this advisory position with the White House would continue with his successor, William Taft. Washington's visit would provoke an outpouring of angry, vicious, blatantly racist responses from Southern politicians and press. Senator James K. Vardaman of Mississippi would complain to the press that White House is so saturated with the odor of nigger that the rats have taken refuge in the stable. The Memphis Scimitar wrote, "This is the most damnedest outrage which was ever perpetrated by any citizen of the United States." The Missouri Sentinel published on its front page a poem entitled "Niggers in the White House," in which it ended suggesting that the president's daughter should marry Washington or his son one of Washington's relatives. And probably the most offensive response came from Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina. It had said that we should have to kill 1,000 niggers to get them back in their place. The Northern press was a bit more gracious. They acknowledged Washington's accomplishments and suggested that dinner was an attempt by Theodore Roosevelt to show that he was everybody's president. Bishop Henry Turner said that that you are a great representative and a hero to the Negro race. But even African American leaders were critical of Washington. William Monroe Trotter called Washington a hypocrite who supports social segregation between whites and blacks while he himself dines in the White House. This reaction affected the White House practice, and no other African Americans was invited to dine in the White House for almost 30 years. Theodore Roosevelt did meet with Washington, but never for a meal. They met in his office during business hours. Theodore Roosevelt continued to speak out against lynchings, but took no significant steps to the cause of African American rights. The controversy hurt Roosevelt's representation and diminished his support within the African American community and shaped his relationship with Washington going forward. It was around this time in 1894 that Washington met a man by the name of William Edward Bernhardt Du Bois. These two were very different men. Du Bois was a writer and scholar based on the East Coast and admired European culture, whereas Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, was an educator and a businessman and was attempting to build a black school in the Deep South. Washington didn't like urban life, and Du Bois felt like cities fostered thought and culture. Their locations and social standing shaped their opposing views on education and racial uplift. Washington saw the benefit of a gradual process, whereas Du Bois wanted a more direct and immediate action. Washington pushed for vocational training, whereas Du Bois favored collegiate education. Du Bois would state, education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. Washington's approach was practical to the masses of children of former slaves, whereas Du Bois focused on advancing the talented 10th, which was an exceptional group of college-educated African Americans who would uplift the Black community. In 1899, Washington invited Du Bois to lead research on all aspects of Black life. He'd envisioned his research with his campaign to improve the Black image in the white mind. Du Bois had reservations that the only opinion that mattered at Tuskegee was Booker T. Washington's, and that Tuskegee was so invested in industrial education that the Black experience would take a back seat. So he declined the offer, explaining to Washington that he could do more good at Atlanta University. During the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois had a third option in Washington, D.C. as an assistant superintendent for a colored school. Du Bois asked Washington for an endorsement for the position, and Washington sent the letter of endorsement, but immediately heard objections from allies in the Capitol because of their support for another candidate named Robert Norrell. When Robert Norrell was appointed to the position, Du Bois was deeply disappointed and suspected that Washington had betrayed him because he didn't take the Tuskegee position. At the same time, Du Bois was seeking the assistant superintendent position in D.C. He was declined a sleeping berth in a Pullman car in Atlanta. He once again asked for Washington's assistance, but Du Bois' disappointment about not getting the assistant superintendent position and his anger about the mistreatment by the railroad appears to have pushed him to alienate himself from Booker T. Washington. He didn't speak a word of this publicly, but it appears that the rift between Washington and Du Bois seemed to have been personal before it was ideological. April of 1903, Du Bois released The Souls of Black Folks. It was a collection of 15 pieces, mostly essays written about Black rural life and observations about the African American experience. Du Bois's book was enormously important, not simply because it was some of the finest writing by a Black person during the period, but also because it laid bare the widening rift between young Black intellectuals like Du Bois and the established Negro leadership under Washington. The book offered sharp criticism for Booker T. Washington, that Washington was a Black leader chosen by whites, having won their favor in 1895 with his Atlanta Compromise. He argued that Washington allegedly surrendered civil and political rights for economic opportunities. Washington had, in his humble approach, made few demands on behalf of Blacks and their white response. Du Bois suggested that Washington's program practically accepted the alleged inferiority of the Negro race. Washington had stressed industrial and agricultural training for Negroes, thus he tended to be anti-intellectual and saw problems from a rural, small town born into slavery's perspective. Washington asked Blacks to forego political power, civil rights, and education. His request was for appeasement and patience on the part of Negroes. Therefore, in the eyes of Du Bois, he ignored the reality of white force and violence against Negro citizenship. Du Bois insisted that Washington's message left the impressions that Negroes' low status justified white prejudice, and that this encouraged whites to shift responsibility for the Negro problem entirely on the Black shoulders. Booker T. Washington failed to make criticisms of whites that they needed to hear but didn't want to hear. He depended on the good of whites in the South and upon white philanthropy from the North. Therefore, his ability as a spokesperson for Negro aspirations could be doubted. He built around him an efficient machine which channeled white goodwill and Republican support to selected Negroes. Thus, they could stifle any criticisms and threat to his power. For these reasons and The Souls of Black Folks, this signaled a break between Washington and Du Bois and galvanized Du Bois as a leader and a spokesman of the anti-Booker T. Washington leadership forces. Publicly, Washington maintained his silence about Du Bois's attack, But Washington deployed resentment toward Du Bois' insinuation of his cowardice. Washington would privately point out the extreme hypocrisy given that Du Bois chose not to vote, but would condemn Washington for surrendering black political rights. Du Bois brought the anti-Washington movement together in a conference in July of 1905 in Buffalo, New York, called the Niagara Movement. It issued a direct challenge to the philosophy and leadership of Booker T. Washington. Having been a subject of tyranny to Washington's political machine, the social conference attendees asked for free speech and ability to criticize in response to what they saw Washington sell out Negroes' political and social rights. They insisted on the principle of manhood suffrage and demanded the abolishment of the caste system based off race or color. While they were willing to concede Washington's concern for the training of the Negro common man, the attendees rejected his anti-intellectual position against higher education for the Negro man's ability to learn. This glaring failure of Washington's model for black advancement had galvanized blacks into action against Washington. He encouraged the training of obsolete crafts and based blacks' economic future on a sick and dying Southern agriculture, and ignored the future urban role of blacks and relied completely on the philanthropy of whites in the North and the South. But none of this was equal to his public blindness to the growing horror of racial violence against blacks. It was this response that blacks and whites organized independent of Booker T. Washington. When the Atlanta massacre happened in 1906, it once again galvanized Washington critics against him. The Atlanta riot of 1906 was a major outbreak of violence in Atlanta, Georgia, that killed at least 12, possibly as many as 25 African Americans, burned more than 1,000 homes and businesses in African American neighborhoods. White mobs, inflamed by newspaper reports of black men attacking and raping white women, with an additional underlying cause of growing racial tensions and a rapidly changing city and economy with competitions for jobs, housing, and political power. Du Bois would write a poem, A Litany in Atlanta, in which again he spoke on Washington. Behold this maimed and broken thing. Dear God, it was a humble black man who toiled and sweat to save a bit of pittance paid to him, and once again, catastrophe for Americans undermined his leadership. Washington worried that indiscriminate condemnation of whites would incite further white backlash. Blacks should talk about their white friends rather than the whites that wished them evil. But in the weeks after the riots, this fell on deaf ears. Bishop Alexander, formerly an ally of Washington, was now a critic. The object of our enemies is to make us serfs. It is nonsense to cry peace when there is no peace. We are determined to rise or die in this new attempt to attain our rights. In the face of these criticisms, Booker T. Washington would work to shape the meaning of what a riot was. The New York World attributed the riot to white labor hostility towards black competition, but Washington would privately dismiss this explanation, stating that neither of the races in the South had reached a point where they would be willing to fight for the opportunity of working. In public, Washington would declare that the riot had changed Atlanta for the better by inspiring blacks and whites to come together afterwards in positive ways. The white Atlanteans had discussed appointing black policemen and a public defender to ensure justice in the courts. This didn't happen in the aftermath in the Wilmington, North Carolina riots. Still, the riot severely damaged Booker T. Washington's standing as the official black leader. Whatever good that emerged in Atlanta in aftermath, the riots produced scenes of ugliness and horror that trumps Washington's positive perspective. The riots raised doubts with his stewardship amongst previous uncommitted and some old friends to withdraw from him, and gave enemies fresh ammunition to fire against him. But Washington's biggest transgression, his biggest issue, was his relationship with Theodore Roosevelt. In August of 1906, the Brownsville affair happened the same year of the Atlanta riots. Black soldiers in a segregated unit of the 25th Infantry Regiment stationed in Fort Brown, when a white bartender was killed and a white police officer was wounded by gunfire. The racial tensions was already high, and the townspeople accused members of the African American 25th Regiment of shooting the bartender and the policeman. Although their commanders said that the soldiers had been in their barracks all night and that evidence had been planted against the men, it was never clear who had actually done the shooting, and it's possible that whites falsely blamed the soldiers to get them transferred out of Brownsville. And even if the black soldiers had done the shooting, it would have only been a few of the black soldiers that had been guilty, but all 167 were dismissed and lost their army pension. Washington would plead with Theodore Roosevelt not to act until further investigation, but Theodore Roosevelt replied that he could not possibly refrain from firing the soldiers. Brownsville affair predictably won Theodore Roosevelt the respect of Southern whites. They called their dismissal the most praiseworthy thing the president had done. This miscarriage of justice and arrogance would taint Roosevelt in the eyes of blacks who already didn't trust him. The stain would instantly spread to Washington, who was his ally and advisor. Washington's refusal to disavow Theodore Roosevelt's decision openly may have been the worst mistake he made of his public career. He may have believed that some of the soldiers were guilty, and it's possible that Washington hoped that he might effect a reversal of the Brownsville dismissal, or at least a modification of Roosevelt's decision. Washington would appeal privately to Secretary of War William Taft to change the order, but Theodore Roosevelt would override. It's possible that Booker T. Washington did not publicly disavow Theodore Roosevelt's decision because keeping silent on events beyond his control had generally proved to be the correct strategy. Controversies usually died down and were forgotten. He also understood that Roosevelt was the most powerful man in the United States with a rash personality and latently racist tendencies. Therefore, Theodore Roosevelt's attitude towards him could change instantly. If he said the wrong thing, public criticism might precipitate a break from Theodore Roosevelt, therefore end any positive influence Washington could have on the White House and the Republican Party. These back-to-back disasters in Atlanta and the Brownsville injustice marked the beginning of a tragic end to Washington's leadership. His influence had risen steadily in 1895 through 1904 when he personified all the hopes for progress among African Americans. As his greatest success as a racial leader derived from his ability to shape Theodore Roosevelt's policies from 1901 to 1904. But what Theodore Roosevelt had given Washington, he took away with the Brownsville affair. Washington never did admit the extent of the damage to his leadership, but by 1907, Washington appeared to be on his way out, with the demise resulting from his mistaken loyalty to Theodore Roosevelt. His largest achievements laid in the building of black men and his inspiration of hope, but his career as a leader of the race will be judged by his political wins and losses. And after 1906, there were not many victories. Washington kept doing things the same way, but he was much less successful and appeared vulnerable, and this fed to the enthusiasm and efforts in those who intended to displace him once and for all. By 1913, at the beginning of the Woodrow Wilson administration, Washington had largely fell out of favor. He remained at Tuskegee Institute until a congenital heart failure ended his life in November 14, 1915. He was only 59. Shortly before he died, Washington had began to abandon his accommodationist tactics in favor of advancing civil rights of black Americans and denouncing unequal educational facilities, disenfranchisement, lynchings, and segregation. It's possible that his legacy could have been much different had he lived, but unfortunately, we will never know. Booker T. Washington had a very complex and polarizing legacy. His views and beliefs were somewhat mixed. He lived through a sea of change for African Americans. He was openly supportive of African Americans taking a back seat to the white community, but he simultaneously secretly funded several court cases that challenged segregation. His emphasis on economic self-determination above political and civil rights fell out of favor as his views of his largest critic, W.E.B. Du Bois, took hold and inspired the civil rights movement. Any discussion about Washington immediately conjures a contrast with W.E.B. Du Bois. The legacy of the two is so intertwined that one cannot be discussed without comparing them to the other. Washington was supported and admired by blacks, but he was equally hated by whites and blacks. A lifelong commitment to African Americans was too often forgotten by the very people he was attempting to help. Washington's school curriculum of progressive ideas, practices was one of the most celebrated models of education, although it was largely criticized for dumbing down the expectations of blacks and preparing them for a life of servitude. Yet today, the need for a skilled work has given rise to efforts to encourage and support career and technical education programs. He also used his position to influence charitable contributions from Northern philanthropists such as Andrew Carnegie, Johnny Rockefeller, and Julius Renwald to many of the nation's other black institutions and causes. Lastly, Washington built one of the great institutions of higher learning in America, Tuskegee University. It continues to stand almost 130 plus years later with thousands of black graduates who are committed to uplifting black people and the quality of life in America. Thank you. This has been One Mic. I'm your host, Country Boy. Once again, if you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page. The link is down in the description. Also, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and listen to The Cut for all your pop culture needs. Thank you and good night. Peace.